Kraken. Sidney Powell has been going around giving interviews. She's been giving very forceful interviews, and I'm not a body language expert, but I do consider myself to be. I trust my own opinion a lot more than other people's when it comes to assessing body language. I'm getting confidence and I'm getting knowledge that I think she has, that she knows more than she's able to say. But there's a part of me saying that if they have something bigger than what's currently pending before the courts, they're running out of time to drop those truths. What's your take on that, and what do you maybe think that she knows that she has not yet said?
Well, I have not had any conversations with her, so I've only seen what's been stated publicly, and I honestly don't know. So we should get the behavior panel on it. They're great, and maybe they can give us an assessment of their view of it. I think your interpretation is correct. That she has great confidence in whatever information she has, and she believes she has evidence that can substantiate it. And so will be a wait and see approach.
Like a lot of people are saying, she's a Trumpy lawyer and she's partisan, blah blah blah. There are things that you would not say as a lawyer, regardless. You're not gonna risk your bar certification. You're not gonna risk publicly lying to millions of people. So there's things that she's saying that I don't care if she's the biggest Trump supporter on earth. You still wouldn't say certain things if you didn't have the concrete evidence to back it up. But what are we now? We are November 15th. There's a 1 day of less than a month before we get to the certification. Stuff has got to move quickly and it's got to move fast in order to sway public opinion and in order to work its way into the public opinion, knowing the way it's going to get suppressed by the media.
I mean, my approach, it was always strategically different. What I had publicly recommended on here was that win the court of public opinion by pointing out the statistical anomalies, pointing out anecdotal evidence of dead people voting, felons voting, people who weren't in the state voting. There have been examples of people who weren't even in the country somehow, and they were no longer citizens of their state, hadn't been for quite some time. In fact, I believe one of them was a sneaky Canadian voting.
No, not me.
Exactly. So and otherwise, I thought that the best approach, and I still think is the best approach, is to just ask for something simple. You don't have to establish voter fraud occurred. Just, hey, I want the procedures that are designed for closely contested elections to be applied, so we have a transparent process. And we have statistical anomalies, in particular in the signature of absentee ballots. The biggest, everybody's agreed, Democratic Party, Republican Party, judges, jurists, scholars, academics, the New York Times, PBS, that the greatest risk of fraud is mail-in balloting, and we had more mail-in balloting than ever in presidential history. Let's make sure there wasn't a fraud there by using the very number one our singular safeguard against fraud, which is the signature match. So my focus was always there, more so than the technological angle. I understand where the concern is, and there's been concerns by many people on the left over the past 20 years raised about this. There's ongoing litigation in Georgia about the use of Dominion software. So my own view is I would like to see election reform where we remove the machines, we remove the computers, we remove the software, and let's do voting the old-fashioned way, which is you fill it out and put it in a box, somebody opens the box and looks at it. So I still prefer that method and mechanism. And because these kind of concerns are clearly going to come about anytime there's a closely contested election and people involved in the election software appear to be politically adverse to one party or the other. So, but I don't know where, I don't know what she's relying on. So I agree with you. She's clearly communicating confidence in the information she has, and we'll have to sort of watch and see what happens with it.
Go on Tim Pool, Viva, and Barnes. Well, Robert might have an easier time getting on than I do. I should have been or was able to. I might have been on Tim Pool, except I can't leave the country. So, and if I do leave the country, coming back is going to be. I got 3 kids and a dog. I can't be quarantined for 2 weeks on both ends. Okay, so actually coming back to a question from before, the 10,000 dead votes coming out of Michigan that People's Pundit determined. Now, here's the thing. So this is, everyone doesn't know, People's Pundit, I believe, did some sort of cross-verification system to show that there were upwards of 10,000 people, deceased people, who cast votes during the Michigan election. The media, in its vigor to disprove what might otherwise be a legit question, says, it's debunked because they went through the list and here are 10 people that were actually alive. Here's one person that's a woman. Tucker Carlson has to apologize because he suggested that a deceased man voted and it's actually a living woman. So they go take the list of 10,000, find however many that were in fact incorrect on that list to debunk the entire list. I don't know how the list was determined. I don't know if it's a legit list, if it's a suspicious list or an unconfirmed list. What do you know about it, and what do you say about the manner through which it was debunked by the media? Debunked.
So, I mean, they basically set up a scarecrow. They call it scarecrow argument. Straw man argument. You set up you take someone's argument and you caricature it in a way that doesn't accurately represent the original argument, so that it's easy to knock down. Hence the phrase straw man. What Richard Barris predicted was, he said, look, here are 10,000 people that appear to be, and he just put it as a suspicious list. He didn't say these 10,000 people were definitely dead. He just said these would fit the parameters of appear to be likely deceased, and we should look at whether or not they in fact are, because they're listed as voting based on the information that he has. And he's been clear all the way through it. Each process he'll say, here's a group of voters, like he'll say in Georgia, there's 130,000 red flags. Doesn't mean that they're not legal voters. It just means that there's a risk they're not a legal voter, disproportionate to the voters group in general. And my understanding is that, and that's what he did with Michigan. And so they set up a straw man. They said, oh, he said 10,000 people who definitely were dead, who definitely didn't vote, which is not what his original proposition was. And then they find a tiny, tiny subsample who they purport to be the people within that list, to say, well, at least a few are alive, which is not normally the standard. I mean, if one dead person voted, that's one person too many who voted, dead people who voted. Because here's the question you have to ask. How did that happen? The only way that happens is if someone else cast the ballot for them. And then you have to ask yourself, do you think they limited themselves to just dead people voting?
Well, and not just that. Do you think it was just a one-off? Like, okay, so you've only found 5 cases. If it's something that can be done, and you found out that it's been done once, it's like finding one ant in your house. You know there's more than one ant in your house if you find one ant. If you've never found an ant, you have no reason. And if you've never seen any evidence of ants in the house, bad analogy, whatever. But yeah, it's like if you find one or multiple cases, it can be done. The manner in which it can be done can be gotten away with. If you discover a few of it, chances are there's much more that you have not discovered. And what's the remedy to that potential problem?
And it means, and the question is the method. Presumably that dead person voted by mail. And so then it raises questions. Okay, what were our fraud checks on mail-in voting? If one dead person voted, that means our fraud check wasn't working, at least as to that one person, because how did the signature match? And so that raises questions. Well, were you doing a signature match? Were you being too liberal in your signature match? I mean, there was some recommended proposals out of Michigan where they said if someone normally has a long cursive signature and you look next to it and they've literally printed their name, they said maybe that signature matches. I mean, that's absurd. So they said normally if you do a whole long name and now you just did a scribble, they said maybe that signature matches too. That's not a signature match. They're not going to cash your check based on that signature. So I think there was a lot of that. I get they want to hide it and cover it up. But my view is rather than force on the people wanting the right rules to be implied to say, no, you have to prove fraud first. That's never been the standard. It's if there was no fraud, then you shouldn't be scared of doing the simple recanvassing that the rules are designed to do in public view that we would require any foreign country do if we were to certify their election or recognize the outcome of their election. So the burden of proof is on them to prove fraud didn't occur by simply allowing the simple check on fraud to be independently confirmed. The fact that they won't tells me something smells in Denmark, as Mr. Hamlet said some years ago.
Now, Michael Green says even Clinton conceded and the votes were a lot closer. First of all, that's why I don't like comparative arguments, because it doesn't matter. Okay, so be it. But I would not have blamed her for not conceding either. That's the thing. Is like you have a duty to those who voted for you to fight for their votes and to protect their vote. But am I wrong? Because I think Nate Brody did a video where he debunked 4 of the alleged voter fraud incidents. One was the Sharpie Gate out of Wisconsin, and so nobody goes repeating that story. Apparently, the plaintiffs voluntarily withdrew their proceedings with permission of the court when they, I guess, were presented with evidence that there was no impropriety. One of the other things that Nate tweeted out the other day was that in Michigan in 2016, there were more votes than voters in a given district. So 2016 was more corrupt than 2020. And my retweet of his tweet was like, yeah, that's the best argument for why we need more scrutiny now, as opposed to less scrutiny now, is we're dealing with districts that have had historical problems, period. But am I wrong in understanding that Jill Stein apparently called off her recounts? Some people might believe because subsequent to her recounts, it appeared that Donald Trump was actually gaining votes compared to the first time around?
Yeah, so I would say a couple of things about Clinton. One, while she publicly conceded, it was her supporters that backed Jill Stein's recount litigation. So they gave her millions and millions of dollars to have that done. And I didn't represent Jill Stein in that capacity, and I had quit representing Jill Stein at that point. I represented her in some other election access cases earlier in the election season. But that's public information. So that's part one. So Clinton conceded in quotation marks. The second part is, what did Hillary Clinton say about this election? She said Joe Biden should not concede no matter what until all proceedings were vindicated. So all Trump is doing is what Hillary Clinton recommended Joe Biden do. Third, the vote wasn't as close. This election in Georgia is much closer than any of those than anything decided in 2016 was. Same in Arizona, and at this point, same in Pennsylvania. And I think Wisconsin is still closer than it was, but the combined 270 electoral votes is combined actually closer as a percentage of the vote from what I've seen. On that side of the equation. The second one is, I think there's been this sort of impermissible burden shifting of saying you have to prove what we have evidence of. When by definition, you're never going to have proof that the signature matches would expose fraud if you never got to see what happened on the signature matches. So, I mean, you're asking people to prove something that they can't by definition prove. They do this a lot in government misconduct cases. The judge will say, well, before I let you see this potential evidence of government misconduct, you have to tell me what's in here. It's like, well, I need to see what's in there before I can tell you whether it's misconduct or not. I just have a reasonable suspicion of it. And so that's where statistical inferential evidence has in the past been found by courts in election contest cases to be sufficient just to get to that discovery stage. And for example, in Georgia, it was simply a drop off between voting for governor and lieutenant governor. Well, look at the swing states. Look at Georgia. There's almost 100,000 people that only voted for Biden that didn't vote for anybody else in the state. That is, according to election experts, including Democratic experts in past Georgia elections, it's self-sufficient to warrant further inquiry. But at any minute, your job isn't, I have to prove fraud before I get the remedy of a recanvass. It's just to make sure the election was properly done in the first place. And so you shouldn't have to prove fraud to be able to get there, when in fact the only proof of fraud will be whether you do it in the first place.
Okay, that is definitely on point. I wonder why Clinton didn't ask for a recount.
She didn't want to be seen as the one responsible for it. That's why she let Jill Stein do it. But to your question,
yeah.
Yes, in Detroit, two things were happening with the recount. One, it was adding votes for Trump. And the other was, in Detroit precincts, they were finding more votes than voters. And that's when they were like, let's shut this down.
Shut it down. Amazing. And because by virtue of the fact that it was shut down back then, none of this really became mainstream media knowledge, public knowledge, and nobody knows. But there are, correct me if I'm wrong, there are no circumstances under which there should be more votes than voters in any given district. Suffice to say?
Oh, absolutely. And I believe that it's happening again in Georgia. We'll find out, but there's initial reports of different places where there's they bring in a ballot box, according to public reports. They bring in a box. It says there's, let's say, 5,000 ballots in there. And they count the ballots, and there's 4,800 ballots in there. And it's like, hold on a second. 5,000 ballots were counted in the election out of that box, and there's a bunch missing. Now, the way that could happen, honestly, without a person being responsible, is if the machines had errors. And we already know they had glitches. And what's interesting is, historically, a manual recount will only change about 1/100% of the total votes. That's not happening right now. There have been recounts in Michigan and for a state legislative race, recounts in New Hampshire for some local races, recounts in Connecticut. And according to Yossi Gessner, they are finding 5 to 6% of the votes were miscounted. That is highly unusual. So there may be a systemic error. And again, it may not be, it doesn't require conspiratorial conclusions. You could just have something that went wrong. You could just have glitches for any reason. That's where my view is. It's like everybody's, oh, you have to mean the glitch has to be fraud. No, you don't. It just means we need to make sure our election processes worked, that the lawful votes were lawfully counted, that we have an honest vote that everybody can have as much confidence in as is practicable. And why all these politicians, including courts, are scared of that makes me wonder what exactly did happen in this election.
Now, Stephen Sheeran is asking, will the Pennsylvania be allowed to have their rules changed? So this is a question now. Oh, I'm sorry. One other thing I wanted to specify earlier is that among the lawsuits that are currently pending, they're not all Trump lawsuits. The ones that are some of the ones that are getting dismissed and sort of passed off publicly as being Trump dismissals, he's getting laughed out of court, are not Trump lawsuits. The ones that were Trump lawsuits that got dismissed by and large on the fact that the question had become sort of academic or moot in that the damage was done. So that's sort of the spin on the massive amounts of lawsuits that are getting laughed out of court. Trump had something of the victory in Pennsylvania. It's a small victory in that I don't want to screw it up, but that they were going to segregate and not count certain ballots that had come in after the 4th.
Yes. So the significance of the ruling was more the legal principle it established. So the number of ballots it impacted was modest, but the rule was the Secretary of State cannot unilaterally alter the rules established for the election by the state legislature under the Electors Clause, which delegates exclusively to the state legislature how the presidential electors will be chosen. And so the establishing that principle has broader application, because in the federal lawsuit that's been filed, the allegation is that a whole bunch of ballots were done in violation of the rules set by the state legislature, including no opportunity to cure selectively in certain counties, the counting of ballots without observation, the way in which signatures apparently were not checked at all in Pennsylvania. And again, when people say, I see the Fox people and some other people saying, how can you prove there's enough people? It's real easy. If 1% of the absentee ballots in most of these states, in some states maybe it's 2%, were improperly counted, that changes the outcome in the election in every one of these states. And I can tell you historically, the norm is at least that percentage in those states. So the idea that Trump could never get anywhere to prove invalid votes is just false. And again, they wouldn't be stonewalling across the country saying, whatever you do, please don't look at the signatures unless there's a problem with the signatures.
Yeah, it drives me nuts. It does not make sense that you could have had 10 times as many mail-in ballots and 10 times less rejection. It doesn't make sense. And if there's a sensible explanation, so be it. Yeah. But to pretend that that's not something that should raise some flags, you have to be willingly closing your eyes. And not in a partisan way, not in a conspiratorial way. Just you have to say, I'm satisfied with the reality in which I'm living. It's good enough, and I don't want to ask any more questions. Speaking of a question, a lot of people have asked this. Timothy Locke, Uncle Salty Cracker reacts to life. Viva Robert, what about Trump's September 2018 executive order on election integrity and scrutiny? Now, that's coming up now because it was referring to foreign interference. I haven't read the executive order. Are you able to speak to this or answer the question?
Yeah, I mean, there's people who believe it could impact this election. And maybe it could. I think there has been a theory out there that Trump put this in motion like deliberately to ensnare people. That is not the case. I'm rather confident of that. So I think that is more hopeful thinking by some folks. That is not in the works, in my view. I'm speculating to some degree. Don't have personal knowledge necessarily, but that's not something. Trump's not going to go through this kind of headache as some sort of ensnarement strategy. That's my view on that. I don't think there are watermark ballots or anything like that. So I don't think that is necessarily the case. I don't think the executive order will likely come into play. I know there's concern because of Dominion. I think Dominion is a Canadian company.
It was based in Toronto. I think it was Canadian. Now I think it's gone to Delaware or something.
That makes sense. And I don't know as much about that. I understand people's concerns about it's why, having, again, software involved and hardware involved in election counting is always going to raise issues. because of who might own it, because of who might sit on the board, because of who might be head of security. It's not good to have the head of security of a major election voting software company be tweeting out and Facebook posting a bunch of anti-Trump stuff. That just,
speaking to the Michigan judgment where he held that against one of the affiants who had posted a COVID-related Facebook post. If we apply the rule equally, we can be equally as cynical and skeptical and suspect of the president of the company that's determining that could in theory determine the election. So what's good for the goose is good for the gander, as we say.
It's one of my favorite rules. Learned it in law school because I was halfway through I showed up in class, and what I would do is I'd read the case in class because that's the kind of law student I was. I figured I'd wait till the exam, but I was halfway through the goose gander case, but I hadn't got to that part of it yet. So the professor called on me, and I answered the question based on the first half of the case. And he was like, well, if you'd read the second half of the case, Bob, then I was like, oh, but that was the goose gander case. Cause he's like, hey, he lays out in the first half of the case why this rule makes no sense. But because it is one that had always been applied, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. Then that came up on my law exam question. Of course, I remember that case very well because of the class, but I've always loved that rule ever since. I think it's unfortunate. What you're seeing is a lot of press and judicial hostility to anybody who will raise these questions. I mean, you're seeing doxing of lawyers. You're seeing personal attacks on law firms. The reason why I have my own independent law firm was that I could not be subject to that kind of coercion or blackmail. But you're seeing lawyers, and the media will say, oh, another group of lawyers leaves Trump. No, what happened is their law firm was under such threat from so many people that they were forced to withdraw, which to me is embarrassing. Well, what kind of self-respecting lawyer withdraws because of political pressure? But that shows you the kind of lawyers we have these days, sadly. But it's also frightening what's happening. I mean, I've done so much of this representation. I've been threatened every way known to man. I've had federal judges threaten me, state court judges threaten me, prosecutors threaten me, rogue agents threaten me. So I've been through enough of it that none of that deters me. But it's sad because I've seen it work on a lot of lawyers, and I'm seeing it work right now on a lot of Trump lawyers who are like, man, I don't want to get near this. I'm going to get tarred and feathered. They're going to come after my career. They're going to come after me personally. They're going to come after my other clients. And that just makes it all worse. I don't know what, I mean, it's like the media, the press, and the institutional powers that be think Soviet show trials were something to emulate rather than something to run away from. They believe gaslighting and gatekeeping are the two ways to manage social control. They don't work. They in fact, it leads to an equal and opposite reaction of people not trusting anything you say or do. So it's amazing. I'm trying to protect the system from itself, but that's the place we find ourselves.
Oh no, that and it was the Lincoln Project who doxed two attorneys and told Twitter to make them famous. I mean, that should be not just violating the terms of service on Twitter. That should be, if it's not, a relatively serious criminal offense, because I don't care what anybody thinks. When you start going after the lawyers who represent even the most vile people on earth, you'll quickly. It's Dave Pacman type level awareness of censorship. It's like, yeah, do it when I hate the person, do it. But then I'm going to come back and complain when Facebook bans me. Someone's going to do it to you one day, and you're going to realize why creating a system where the advocates literally become the targets is how things break down in a very, very serious way. So I don't know what sanctions or who's going to go after the Lincoln Project for that, or what Twitter did to them, but